Alright, so welcome back. In our previous lectures, we created a server and a client and tried to communicate with them. So in this lecture, we are going to create a more organized program, and then we will start building our remote access tool on top of it. So here our goal is to create a program that will allow us to achieve certain tasks on our victim machine. For example, it can help us to, for example, let's say run commands on the remote system. So you give the commands from the server and these commands are executed on the victim machine and you get the results back to the server or hacker machine. So similarly, you will be able to download or upload files to your victim machine. Also, you will access some other features as well, which we will develop as we go along. So the first goal is to create connection. So we will create a class called server, and then we will also create a class called client connection. And these classes will help us to create connection. So instead of writing as a main program, we will create classes so that we can use it later if we need them. And this is a more Pythonic approach. So I have created a directory in our main project folder called core, and in this directory I have a file called connection.py. And now we will start developing this connection.py. So the first thing we need to do is we will import socket. And once we have imported socket, we will create a class. So I'm going to call it server connection. And then we will create the constructor here. So it should be underscore init, and it will contain a self call. And then we will create the socket here. So we can say socket.socket, and then we will call the socket.af underscore inet. And similarly, we call the sock stream as well. So socket.sockstream. And then we will initialize this into a variable called self.socket. So now this whole connection is, our socket is associated with this class. So if we call an instance of this class, this socket will be created automatically. Okay, so the next function we are going to create is called, so let's create the documentation here as well. So instead of like this, so I'm going to create the documentation as well. So summary creates a socket, creates a TCP socket for server. Okay, let's fill it here. Okay, so now we will create a function called create connection. So this will take the IP address and the port, and it will try to listen on this incoming port. So we will call this function as create connection, and then it will take self and also the IP address. So by default we set the IP address to the local IP address. So if you leave the string empty, it means that when you call this function here, which is server.bind, if you leave this as empty, for example server IP as empty strings, it will by default take system's IP address. So you don't have to give the value here, and then it will take in the port number. So let's, by default we will select the port 8080. Otherwise, if the user gives an port number, we can change the value. So the next step is to, if you go to the main file, so first we create a socket and then we bind this socket to this address. So now we have to bind it. So let's call it self.socket, and then we have to bind it. So in order to bind it, we can call the bind function here, and then we require the address here. So let's call it self.server IP equals to IP, and similarly self.server port equals to port, and then we will give these values here. So we want to give this as a tuple, so I'm going to create a new variable called address, equals to, and it would be self dot server IP and self dot server port, and then we can give the address here, so self dot address. So now we have a connection complete. So if we call this function create connection, it will create the connection and bind this socket with it, or the IP address with this socket. So that's it for this lecture. In next lecture we will create more functions and proceed further.